So, welcome everybody to the seminar. I'm going to pass around, whoever didn't receive one last week, I'm going to pass around the schedule for next semester. There's one last seminar after today on the 1st of December. We don't meet next week because of Thanksgiving. Professor Ed Kaplan is speaking on the 1st of December, which is in 2 weeks from today. So I'll pass this around. And I'll also pass a sign-up sheet. If anybody is not on our email list, please feel free to sign up, and we'll make sure you're on the list. So it's with pleasure and honor that I introduce to you Professor Barry Kosmin. He's the current and new director of the new Institute for the Study of Secularism in Society and Culture. That's at Trinity College in Hartford. He just moved here from London recently, a couple of months ago. He's a sociologist and a research professor in public policy and law at Trinity. Today's title is called Judeophobia and the New European Extremism. Barry Kosmin was the executive director of the JPR Institute for Jewish Policy Research in London, and he was the associate director of the HRB Park Center for Jewish and Non-Jewish Relations at the University of Southampton in London. He was formerly the director of research at the unit of the Board of Deputies of the British Jewish Community, director of research for the North American Council of Federations in New York. He was the founding director of the North American Jewish Data Bank at City University of New York, where he did extensive demographic and sociological studies of the Jewish community in North America. And he was the member of the doctoral faculty in sociology at City University of New York at the graduate school, and a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Hebrew University. He's now the joint editor of a new, he's the joint editor of the academic journal Patterns and Prejudice, and the co-editor with Paul Ignaski of Essex University in England of a very important book that recently came out called The New Anti-Semitism, Debating Judeophobia in the 21st Century Britain. So it's a great pleasure that I welcome you.
Okay. Well, Bobby will be proud of what you said. The book, in case anybody's ever seen it, this is the book where it's under that Charles referred to. It's Anti-Semitism, Debating Judeophobia in 21st Century Britain. What I'm going to talk about today, don't let anybody get illusions of grandeur. I actually had lunch with important people today. Didn't have time to change. But it was I had lunch with Charles Curran, the Catholic theologian, and a number of others. And the issue that came up there was something which I think relates to this topic, which is the question of modernism and anti-modernism. The new European extremism, as I see it, is about reactionary forces. Now, reactionary forces normally pick on somebody, usually the Jews. The interesting thing today is the reactionary forces in Europe are found not only on the far right, which has traditionally been there. The Catholic Church, since Vatican II, has been modernist in its outlook, and therefore the anti-modernist and the traditional anti-Semitism of the Catholic Church, I would suggest to you, has abated in the last 20 or 30 years, especially notable despite the fact that John Paul II was a conservative in religious terms, he was very much a liberal and an ecumenist, and in world terms, in secular terms, if I can use that phrase about the pontiff. So those are the kinds of issues that I've been thinking today, and I thought they were actually directly relevant in some ways to the subject I'm talking about now, the new European extremism. Now, I did send a paper in advance. It was short, 6 pages. Did any of in this class read it?
I read it. I get an A.
All right. I didn't want to get marked. I wanted you to. I wanted people to read. All right. So it gives me an idea that about sort of 10% as usual. You don't do much better than the average group of 18-year-olds. So maybe I should go through this paper a little. I'll explain to you the provenance of this, because I think this, following the book Paul and I co-edited, which was really in response to the upsurge of anti-Semitic, what we call Judeophobic, sentiments and expressions and fashion, at least in Britain, following really 2000. 2000 began with the Second Intifada, increased dramatically after 9/11, and has ebbed a little bit in the last few months for a number of reasons, such as being in the front line yourself. We decided to take on another project when I was at the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, which was to look at this new European extremism as we saw it. In other words, a new European extremism rather than new European anti-Semitism on a wider scale. And we recruited a number of authors to give us views from various countries about this. I'll pass around some details of this so you can see. This is off the website of the JPR. It's actually off the website of something called AXT, Anti-Semitism and Xenophobia Today. And what is attached to it is an outline of a book that Paul and I are editing, which will come out beginning of next year from Profile Books, under the title The New European Extremism, Hating Israel, America and the Jews. And as I say, I think that is about anti-modernism, and those three countries, or those two countries and that one people, are new targets for this kind of thinking. So let me start off with what I try to do in the paper. I'm not going to read it to you. Those of you who want to look at it, it's on the website, isn't it? What I try to do is put this extremism and its linkage to what I call in this paper here, which is a kind of introduction to our part of our introductory essay to the book, in a political context, and to show some of the content that is involved in this topic. And I've defined extremism. I will indulge myself a little bit. My definition of extremism is open or tacit support to the ideas and policies of totalitarian political ideologies and parties, as well as Manichaean ideas. The clearest, and then I go on to attack say something's rotten in the state of Denmark, and then I focus in on the election results in the French Republic in 2002. Most of you have heard of Jean-Marie Le Pen. I know he did pretty well in those elections, but if you add up the two Front National type parties, right-wing, those with a kind of nostalgia for Vichy in the old world, they got 19.1%, and a variety of communists and Trotskyists polled 12.4%, which means that in a free election in the early 2002, nearly a third, 1 in 3 French voters, supported or voted for totalitarian ideologies, which I think it's fair to say did in the 20th century bring us interesting things like the gulags, death camps, wars, purges, misery and death for millions of people. Now, voting for those kind of parties in the 1930s is interesting because you didn't have a historical record. Voting for those kind of parties in 2002, I would suggest, suggests a very different mindset. It's a kind of amnesia, if not Alzheimer's disease. So why do large numbers of Europeans, or at least French people, vote for these? And why is there this extremism abroad in Europe at this particular moment? I'm sure all the francophones and Mr. Chirac's people in the audience will come at me, like picking on him especially, picking on France, but it's a very good example. Now, as we know, the attraction of there is an attraction of extremism to large numbers of people, and 20th century Europe has suggested it's pretty good ratings. This present generation has not, as I said, experienced war, unemployment, mass unemployment, or hunger. Interesting. Moreover, as I say, they've had the historical record plainly before him. And that record suggests that this utopian idealism, if you don't even regard it as extremism, but you regard it as forms of utopian idealism, which is a polite way of expressing those ideas, it undoubtedly, the record suggests, produces hate, prejudice, discrimination, and almost always ends in some kind of tragedy of some kind. The Downfall is a good German film to look at. The answer, I believe, is that there's clear incentives and motives for hatred and prejudice in the world, particularly of the political variety. It serves also the personal agendas of individuals. It meets their psychological need to make sense of the world around them. It's particularly true regarding Jews, or making sense of the Jews in Europe. So what I try to do in this paper is offer a logical, political and psychological explanation for what at first sight might appear to some of you as being irrational thinking, supporting utopian idealism, extremism, rather nutty, lunatic politicians of various descriptions. And what I'm trying to do, what I don't dwell in this paper, is on the usual manifestations as they are portrayed, or usual indicators which are shown. And the usual indicators are, of course, anti-Semitic incidents, in other words, crime statistics of some kind. That's what really anti-Semitic incidents fall into. Hate crimes. Or in terms of electoral support, which often depends on the kind of political system, the electoral system in any particular country. And there are kind of peculiarities of political systems that tend to push to explain away why certain countries produce more political extremists or political parties than others. And instead, in this, I concentrate on the intellectual processes that underlie the behaviour and the actions of the perpetrators, and I look at the role of the intelligentsia in creating the climate of bigotry. And what I do is I look back historically and suggest that, in fact, the European intelligentsia, even the most fashionable portions of it, appeared at one time to be sort of relatively avant-garde members of it, have a record which is not very good on this. And looking at the role of intellectuals, I contrast, and right, let me step back a bit. One of the great themes in European history, and many of the kind of weak or liberal views of history is condemnation of the mob, the kind of Rude, I don't know if any people know, the Rude version of history, the kind of the brutal, ignorant mob, in contrast with the urbane, well-meaning intellectuals and elites. And I would suggest that this, in fact, is a liberal myth. That, in fact, large numbers of the intellectuals and elites have, in fact, indulged in pretty miserable things. And, in fact, the mob, or the uneducated and the ignorant, actually are not very good for extremists and totalitarian parties because they lose interest and concentration very quickly. As they get drunk and forget the purpose which they're about burning things down, and then they go around and burn down the wrong place. And if you think about it historically, of course, it's Dr. Goebbels, PhD Heidelberg, in 1922, and his friends, and even some of the Einsatz group, and I think someone suggested they were pretty well-educated Germans, a lot of university graduates amongst them, actually were better for this kind of work. But of course, where does the myth begin? It begins actually with sort of Adam Smith, it's a favourite probably for some of you, at least in Chicago. An instructed and intelligent people are always more decent and orderly than an ignorant and stupid one. That's Adam Smith. I'm suggesting, at least in this particular case, it might not be true. So that's one piece. And this kind of physicality and boorishness of the benighted against the refinement and sophistication of the learned classes can be argued a great deal. Now, what I do is then go on and go into a number of people like, I just have some ideas which let me go with John Maynard Keynes. And why the importance of ideas and ideology and intelligences in this thing, of course, is because, as Keynes, another economist, suggested, ideas, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. I am sure the power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared to the gradual encroachment of ideas. Nietzsche, of course, claimed that the root of political psychology is resentment, or he put it in French, ressentiment, was a distinguished social emotion of modern societies. His thesis was that other people's or groups' success breeds resentment, and resentment in turn breeds hate. It's a passion bound up with the identity of the one who feels it, and he rejoices in damaging others by virtue of their membership of the targeted group. Moreover, particularly in insecure epochs, hatred brings order out of chaos and decision out of uncertainties. I'm just applying the same thing all over again. Why do certain groups of people feel insecure at the moment in Europe, I guess? And I've looked back, and one of the themes I've latched on to is the essay by Julien Benda, La Trahison des Clercs, which is in 1927, in which Benda actually made a rather dire prophecy about European intellectual classes. It was really an attack on people like D'Annunzio and the kind of romantics who supported Mussolini and his imperial grandeur, or reaches for imperial grandeur and delusions. And Benda spoke of the intelligentsia of his day in Europe by saying that they had abandoned their traditional panoply of philosophical and scholarly ideals, whereby for centuries they exhorted men to deaden the feeling of their differences, and instead had come to support and favour the intellectual organisation of political hatreds. And I know it's a very good example, shorthand for what happened in Europe between the wars, the intellectual organisation of political hatreds. Texts and books were produced, and they were regarded as reasonably intellectual. And then go back into looking in the Germans. We can go back and look at Wagner, and some incidents. But one of the points, prescient words, and I've looked for sort of people who seem to be prophets of this, I would say, episodic or even cyclical pattern in Europe. One of the leading lights of the Aufklärung in the German Enlightenment was Lichtenberg, a scientist. And he suggested in one of his more trenchant aphorisms the following: "Today we are trying to spread knowledge everywhere. Who knows if in centuries to come there will not be universities for re-establishing our former ignorance." Probably thinking of Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, something like that in the 1970s. But if you look at the work of Wagner and Liszt, who are regarded as intellectuals or elites, part of the intellectual elites of their days, you can see some of this taken up, their ideas taken up later by someone like von Treitschke. Von Treitschke was the greatest German historian of his age, professor of history at the University of Berlin. In 1879, he was the one who coined the phrase, "Die Juden sind unser Unglück," the Jews are our misfortune. Treitschke, of course, died in 1896, but his ideas lived on. 50 years later, this identical phrase, of course, became a slogan on the front of the Nazi Party newspaper, Die Sterne, which was used, obviously, to inspire the stormtroopers. Now, obviously, postmodern fashion would suggest that some of these things I'm talking about are coincidences. Yet, I think it's probably significant that the publisher of this newspaper, Julius Streicher, was eventually tried at Nuremberg and executed for, in the indictment, crimes against humanity, which is an interesting point in terms of the argument I'm making here. The actual statement of the judge was he'd been convicted of poisoning the minds of a generation. So it's a resounding endorsement, really, of what Keynes had just said about the power of ideas. So it's equally important, obviously, for us at this particular moment to note this innovation in international law, because we hear a tremendous amount of international law and human rights. Not a lot on this idea, that ideas and words have consequences, and the incitement to hatred and advocacy of murder and genocide is as much a crime as an act itself, and we have a precedent for somebody being executed for that purpose. Now, once we understand that ideas are freestanding and powerful, we sort of get an indispensable tool for combating some of the insidious arguments, of course, that victims cause their own problems. And it's often, and again, that is often being applied to Jews. What I'm going to then go on to suggest is that there are intellectuals both of the left and the far right, far left, although they're moving into the centre all the time in Europe, who now are increasingly using expressions, terms, and etc. This is journalists, pundits, moralists, pontificators, even some church people. A barrage of agitprop, interestingly enough, against America, who are actually neoconservatives, Israel and Jews. A lot of the problems and uncertainties of Europe are caused by one or two or three of these things in combination. So what I really try to do is look at what's new about this quality in terms of, is it new in terms of what I've done is try to show 18th and 19th century provenance for some of these ideas and 20th century action and experience. But what is new about them in the 21st century in Europe? Well, what is interesting is that a lot of this is anti-modernity. But it's the, as I said, it's the anti-modernity of the old Soviet Union under Brezhnev and something like that. Or conservative thinking, if you want to put it the other way around. It's definitely modernity, it's definitely disillusion and antagonism to what we might call Western free market liberalism, which in the minds of many of these people in Europe is associated with the United States and Jews. And we have a range of forces now in Europe which are not working in concert, but actually if you look at their ideas and their publications, you come up with the same thing. These are this kind of a red, brown, green alliance. Now these people don't particularly like each other. Right? So the red are the far left, the browns are the old brown right, and the green is the new Islamist, Muslim, politicizing Islam, which is increasingly under the control of the Muslim Brotherhoods and its offshoots in Europe. And it's what we might call a new kind of anti-imperialism of fools. It's one of the few things that you'll see that the songs, the sound bites, slogans are exactly the same. It was very interestingly, one of our writers, a man called Perker, writing from Austrian writer, university academic, writes about a demonstration outside the Jewish Community Centre in Vienna a year or two ago, in which there was a group of people saying, Austria for the Austrians, Palestine for the Palestinians. And it was we can imagine where the actual Jewish Community Centre people were supposed to go. I guess they were supposed to get on trains for Poland at that moment. But it was the demonstration of the Revolutionary Communist League in Austria, which was joined by a number of right-wing people, ex-SS. So it's, this is equal opportunity work. Now, I do, in my paper, go into some sociological theory about Pareto's theory of revolution, which focuses on social mobility, or frustrated social mobility of certain classes is what creates antagonism and towards others, in terms of what Bender and others, and even Nietzsche have suggested. there is no doubt that the mobility for what the new class, the European intellectuals, are becoming frustrated because, in fact, university, I mean, you take my own country, I guess that's one of the reasons I'm here. University professors have lost status and buying power in creation in relation to other people. When I first went to university, 1960s, a university professor earned as much as a good lawyer in London. That's not today. It's probably 15% of his London. And so there's a very important issue here about the economic downturn in Europe and the forfeiture of social and economic status as a result of the Big Bang in finance organised by Mrs. Thatcher in the City of London, which favours entrepreneurs, people with commercial activity, over public services and teaching and people like that. In effect, if you want to, and it plays out in some of the evidence we look at, Financial Times readers are favoured over Guardianistas, readers of the Guardian, who have therefore become frustrated and angry with the current state of a world dominated by you-know-who. Now, to some extent, the French left and intelligentsia went down this road before. We saw it that France had this problem in the 20s and 30s, the Vichy regime, and we also saw some of the reaction of an intelligentsia to their frustrations. I won't go through, obviously it was in Germany. As you know, the expulsion of the professors and the Jewish students in the 1930s was met with hardly any demonstrations by other members of the campus community. There were no boycotts of universities or withdrawal of labour or any of those other kinds of things you'd expect when your colleagues get the sack for their origins rather than for their incompetence. If you look at the French prominent writers, André Gide, Paul Claudel, François Mauriac, Jules Romain, Dugard, even André Malraux, until nearly the end of the war, the rule in France was really silence or inaction. It's very interesting if you look, one of the people who supplies some of this information is Michael Curtis, who wrote The Verdict on Vichy. Silence of the left in France during the Vichy regime is interesting, and I think it is important today. Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir strongly influenced the climate of intellectual opinion over the world. The heroic Simone de Beauvoir worked for a time at a cultural program for Radio Nationale in occupied Paris. Jean-Paul Sartre, her companion, happily replaced a dismissed Jewish professor of philosophy. Liberal professions were no better. 1999 it was until the French Doctors Association acknowledged that the basic values of their profession had been violated when they acquiesced in legislation that discriminated against and excluded their Jewish colleagues from practicing. It took to 1999 for the French Medical Association to apologise to the Jews who lost their jobs or expelled. So I just want to put that into context here. We're not, and some of these people are still around, of course. I mean, longevity isn't an issue. Now, what's new about this? I mean, what am I really saying? It's the same thing all over again. Well, what's new about it is that it's spread more. There are more people out there with these ideas. As I said, it's not just the far right. We're seeing elements of reds and greens. The morality and character flaws of the intellectual elite, which I question, of course, has different implications in a society where 5% of the people go to university to one where 30, 40 or 50% of the people go to university, the younger generation. So there's the reach of universities. And of course these universities, as I say, have a history of prejudice and discrimination. If you think about it, again, right, even in this country until the 50s, 60s, you had quotas, in effect, numerous clauses in Europe, religion tests in most universities for many, many years. So higher education has never been free of these kind of things. We see it as being a world of liberty and tolerance and all the rest of it. And that, combined with what I would call a nouvelle déclassée, the new status of intellectuals, probably explains, I think, a lot of the kind of anti-Israel boycott and things like that which is around, this tendency to kind of lash out. Now, why do we call it Judeophobia, not anti-Semitism? Well, in a European context, anti-Semitism these days means eliminationist, genocidal politics. You can't get away from it. Everybody will turn around and say, we face them, and I've done the debates and talks and seen people on TV and all the rest of it. And someone will turn around and say, look, you know, I'm not an anti-Semite because I'm not a Nazi. I don't wear armbands and shiny boots. And to the mass of the population, that is acceptable. It's an acceptable answer. Anti-Semitism, an anti-Semite is somebody who wants to kill large numbers of Jews. Discriminate against them, putting them on a reservation, I don't know, taxing them heavily or differently to other people, is not regarded as particularly anti-Semitic. That's regarded kind of forms of prejudice or cultural or social engineering. But you cannot get away today in most of Western Europe by calling somebody an anti-Semite. As two people, George Galloway, John Pilger, people who are known for their tremendous antipathy towards Israel and say very nasty things about. Both of whom have said, you know, what do I? The first thing when anybody calls me an anti-Semite is I reach for my defamation or libel law. That's their reaction immediately. I'm not a Nazi because that's what it means. And we have some evidence that, at least in British courts, which are very, very amenable to, are very easy to get defamation cases. You don't actually have to prove that it's wrong. You just have to prove that it's done you harm. To point out that you're a member of you're a general in the SS, probably might do you some harm somewhere. If that is regarded by some juries or judges as being unacceptable background information, you've got a problem. But the other thing about it is that most of the Judeophobia is essentially political. It is not racial. It is not biological. That's the other side of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism in the European context is a form of racism which is associated with biological prejudices, biological racism. Measuring heads and doing colour coding of the population and things like that. And none of these people really talk about it. The other thing about it is that it's not very individual either. It's hardly ever applied to individuals. It's kind of class thing. Hardly any. It's very interesting. Today, everybody's very, very careful not to pick on a particular individual. And again, maybe because there are laws, both these defamation and libel laws, and at the same time, there's class protection and race relations acts and things like that in most of Europe. So it's hardly, it's not personal except when down a dark alley or something like that, when it gets personal. But that's not what I'm discussing here. The other thing about it is that it's hardly economic. One of the main attractions to large numbers of people in Europe in the 19th and 20th century of anti-Semitism was an economic agenda. The idea that the Jews, again as a modernizing force, had too much, had too many positions of authority, power, placement, but especially the role of Jewish business and banking and things like that. Now, interestingly enough, very little of this is economically motivated. The economics hardly ever comes up. This kind of material envy is not really articulated in any kind of way by these people. Which I guess, if you're if you're trying to advocate on behalf of oil sheikhs, is probably understandable on occasion. Difficult. So it's not racist, it's not economic. It tends, and I'm sure everybody else has gone through it, it sees the Jews as a collectivity. It's not personal. As a result, it does allow the option for some careerist or even collaborationist Jews to take part in this in this process. And that's another point which is different to the anti-Semitism in the past. It's more like the old communist anti-Semitism. The Communist Party would allow individual Jews in, so they could close down the Yiddish schools in the Soviet Union. Better Jew signs of paper than Stalin himself. But that's I'll take questions at the end of this. But it's quite important to realise that people of Jewish extraction, some people would say most of the Jewishness extracted, can participate in some of this activity. So that's another piece. Of course, however nationalistic you were as a German, the Nazi Party wasn't going to recruit you or allow you to take a position of power and authority. Right? You obviously see that, and that's the uniqueness. And that's, again, why this anti-Semitism doesn't fit. Because you can't be anti-Semites. The Nazis didn't even want to have sex with Jews. They know these people. So that's why I'm not an anti-Semite. I understand how this builds up, and the view of what anti-Semitism is, and how it kind of rebounds against Jews in some kind of way. Now, certainly, Judeophobia is a good word because it means fear and loathing. And there's lots of fear and loathing going on about Israel and sometimes Americans and sometimes Jews. And that is tied up with a lot of anti-modernism also. So I think, in terms of anybody here interested in strategies, which I spent some time thinking about, how people should react to this and how the Jewish community should operate, the European Jewish community should operate as well, we have to be careful to make it quite clear that what we're talking about is nasty people, not Nazis. Right? Nasty but not Nazi. And that's what you have to say all the time. It is using the epithet Nazi doesn't work, as you know. Its currency has been devalued, because even Israelis throw it at each other all the time. We get a pretty bad situation. But that's in some ways sort of a postmodernist reality. And it's not easy to refute some of the responses if you start accusing people of being Nazi. What I've tried to explain here and suggest why there are strident calls for academic boycotts of Israeli universities and scholars, campaigns for economic divestment from Israel, but not, of course, actions against states such as China and Sudan. And that's where we, I think, have to always say, yeah, but that's okay. You don't like the Jews, you don't like Israel, but why do you like these other people? Why aren't they in your gun sites? Why the pacifist Tibetans and the Dalai Lama, why are they inherently less deserving than perhaps Palestinians? Raped and pillaged, murdered Africans in Sudan, not worthy of a boycott or a petition at any British university until the beginning of this year. Not one. It might be that, of course, that Tibetans and Africans are just not very nice people. I doubt if any of these people admit that. I think what the reality is they have the wrong sort of oppressors. And going back to some of these alliances. If your oppressor is a communist or an Arab, don't look for many of these people to take much notice of you. European elites are obsessed with the sins and the crimes of the Jews again. It's not unexpected, it's not unprecedented, but the fact that they do it without actually being very much interested in many other people's sins and crimes, I think it's fascinating. It's a reality that what we've created here is an anti-Semitism, but there's not a racism. There's Judeophobia, therefore, and it's very important for me to point it out. It's not part of general racism to these mindsets. And therefore the collateral damage is that free Tibet is lost because free Palestine is much more important. But the wrapping up of this in a more globalist framework strikes me as a better Jewish response than the traditional one of refighting World War II. It's not refighting World War II. You have a much more difficult situation in Europe today because these arguments, criticisms, and general hostility are both tempered, very cleverly directed, and what did I say? And framed in terms which are hard to react to on the specificity of the case. In other words, by just arguing in defence of the question is, when did you last beat your wife? And any defence to that is difficult. Thank you.
So I thought I'll take the prerogative of asking the first question. I was wondering if you can maybe elaborate on this notion of anti-modernism. So while you were speaking, I was thinking there's a young PhD student here named Ben Madley who's doing research tracing the German experience in Namibia and how people who committed genocide, Germans colonized Namibia and they killed up to 1 million Namibians, and a lot of the people who were serving in the German army at the time went back to Germany and became engaged in the state apparatus and in the military. So in a sense, even though Nazism had a lot of sort of anti-modernist rhetoric, it was still very much, I would argue, a modernist enterprise. So at one level, I was wondering if you can speak on that. And now I'm also thinking too, in terms of the contemporary context, in terms of globalization, you have people like Zygmunt Bauman and Anthony Giddens that are looking at how globalization brings together people as much as it brings people, it marginalizes people. And I'm thinking of the French context today, where you have anti-modernist, maybe political or social movements, but are they not created by globalization and sort of neoliberal, modern economic development?
Well, I mean, recognising that these things happen and endorsing them are two different things. I mean, you have to understand, a lot of people, will accept the fact. I mean, the satellite technology. I might think the world's flat, but it's a reality. So I'd like the world to be flat, and I can go on suggesting it. But then, I mean, the ability of human beings to operate schizophrenically or in two minds is very different. The anti-modernism can't be seen just as a reaction to it's not an anti-technology. If you take, I mean, many people would say, the Nazi and fascist movements were anti-modern. They were throwbacks to one group of people wanted to be Vikings, the other people wanted to be a Roman emperor and Romans and have standards and all the rest of it. That doesn't mean to say that Mussolini, for instance, was not one of the biggest patrons of modernist architecture. I mean, that was where it went, the modernist arts. Hitler, that was a young generation, and they embraced, he was the first politician to use the aeroplane to do election campaigning. German Nazi, I mean, the embrace of technology is quite clear. But when I'm talking about anti-modernism, this is what I'm talking about ideas. It's an ideas. It's an ideology. It's a myth. It's a figment. But there are certain parts of the modern world. I mean, you've got many people. I mean, take the Islamic world today. Take some of the Christian fundamentalists who are there. I mean, their embrace of the modern technology is clear. They were quite happy with all the modern gadgets and all the rest of it, but they're using them to other ends. In other words, they embrace. I mean, and I'm running at the moment in trying to take on this institute and study of secularism in society and culture, and this takes me into talking to historians about Galileo and things like that. And the issue, of course, is the difference between science and technology. You embrace the theory. You can the products, right? The technological products are one thing. The scientific embracing or imbibing or accepting the scientific theory is another. I mean, this is very important. Now, you've got again, we're winding the topic here. You have Kansas farmers using genetically modified crops and all the rest of it, and then arguing for intelligent design on Sundays or in their school. I mean, it doesn't make sense. But people can do that. You argue against the theory that produces your income, right? In this case, but that's these people are exactly the same. So I think anti-modernism. It's some of the products of it. It's the societal and even psychological, psychological outcomes which they have gains, much more than some of the material pieces.
Yes, people talk about phobias in this country, so there's homophobia. And I don't know, Greek, I thought of phobia as fear of. You talked about this as fear and loathing. Also, we talk in America about hate crimes, hate speech. Then you also in your paper talked about resentment. To me, one of the benefits or nice things about the term anti-Semitism or anti-Jewishness or anti-Judaism is it doesn't try to name that emotion. And I don't know, my guess is some people hate Jews, and some people fear Jews, and some people loathe Jews, and some people resent Jews. So I wanted you to speak to that. If you named the wrong emotion, but the behavior is still there, whether it's what they say or what they do, that's really what we're concerned about, isn't it?
Well, what I'm telling you is, I'm willing to accept that anti-Semitism, first of all, anti-Semitism was a word created by an anti-Semite, right? So it might not be of a good provenance either, right? In terms of, and Semitism is another word. What are we talking about? It's plays. Somebody accuses them, you'll sit on the BBC one night and someone will accuse some Arab guy of being anti-Semitic. He says, I can't be anti-Semitic, I'm a Semite. And whether you like it or not, Semitism, is to do with, comes out of linguistics, right? The Semitic languages, which was then created, into racial theories and all the rest of it, the people who spoke these languages. What I'm telling you is in the practical world of politics today, right, it is very difficult to use this term in a European setting. Now, maybe you can use it in New Haven, and people will, sort of be ashamed if you say that. But the fact is, it doesn't. The Judeophobia is, I think it's an interesting thing because this is, again, all the connotations of anti-Semitism are about death camps, right? And someone is, it's a difference between if I said to say, I feel sick now, and sick meant only life-threatening diseases, how would I describe a common cold? That's the problem you have. It's a question of degree between black and white, right? Philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism. There have to be 1,000 shades of grey. Right? So what I'm saying is, as defined by these people, it's a get-out. You can't use it. It has the instant retort of, I'm not anti-Semitic. I love Jews. I went to a Holocaust Memorial Day, whatever it was, and my girlfriend's mother's brother is Jewish. That's what you get, and that, as far as large numbers of people, it's a convincing argument. Right? So the middle ground, or whatever you want to call it, or the uninitiated. So that's what I'm saying. Judeophobia, however, it works. As you say, homophobia it is more than fear. It's fear and loathing. It works both ways. It's like arachnophobia or something like that. It means much more. It works. That's what I'm suggesting. It's not an ideal situation, but we're not. It's not an ideal solution, but we're not dealing with an ideal situation. It's a difficult one. And we have to realize that part of this is academic, and part of it is really practical, in terms of community relations and defense.
I'm confused by this.
Good.
You say this is not racist, it's most Judeophobia is political, and you point out very clearly in the last paragraph of your paper that there's no outcry against Chinese occupation of Tibet and what's going on in Sudan and so forth. So why the selectivity of the antipathy toward the Jews? When you look up anti-Semitism in the dictionary, as I've done, it's a coined phrase and it has nothing to do with the Semitic people. It is, as coined, I forget who
Wilhelm
coined the
Wilhelm
term,
Marr.
but it's anti-Jewish specifically. It's not anti-Semitic people. And so when you have this selectivity of what Jews are doing, why not call a spade a spade?
Because it doesn't work. Just explain, try and explain it. I mean, you can go on turning around and saying, I'm a duck and I quack, but these people think elephants quack, so you've got a problem, right? I mean, how do you deal with it? You've got to communicate, and so your problem is, and you're saying the selectivity. There's a difference between prejudice and racism, right? There's a prejudice there, right? There's undoubtedly a prejudice. That it's not, that this prejudice is not based on any theories of biological different hierarchies of DNA is a reality today. I mean, they just have to accept that. It's not the way they thought. I mean, they dislike Jews other than for their biology. That's the difference.
Yeah, I'll ask you the same question I asked Phyllis Chesler when she spoke in New Haven here last year or so. But I'll use the appropriate word substitution. Would you regard either Michael Lerner or Noam Chomsky as Judeophobes? Let's make it concrete here.
Very
What we're
concrete.
talking about.
Well, Michael Lerner, no. So there's any evidence that Michael Lerner is I mean, he has a certain view of Jewish people, Jewish future. I think that probably the beauty of the thing Judeophobic is that, in some ways, it would be ridiculous to accuse a Jew of being anti-Semitic, because it does seem to be pretty ridiculous to say on racial grounds you want to eradicate. If we go down that road, you can't accuse them of being anti-Semitic because if and this is the kind of secular argument here. There's a problem. If anti-Semitism connotes, and this happens all the time, I can't be an anti-Semite because Noam Chomsky said the same thing, right? And he's obviously not a Nazi. He doesn't want to kill all his family and everybody else. So therefore, anti-Semitism is therefore put in this little box, right? So what am I saying? No, I agree with them. These guys are not anti-Semites within that definition. Are they Judeophobic? If you see it as not learner, because he has a commitment to a certain view of the Jewish future, right? And a certain, I would suggest that he has a feeling of common destiny of Jews. Chomsky, I don't know well enough what he's actually written on this, although I've read some of his stuff many years ago. But I mean, the issue there is, can you be antagonistic to the Jewish collectivity and its collective future rather than the individual organisms that make it up? And within this definition, I would say that the people who ran, for instance, the Yevsektia, the Jewish section of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, who decided to close down all Jewish schools and make an example of the Jews, right, as the first new Soviet man or woman, were Judeophobic. They didn't want to kill large numbers of Jews. What they wanted to do was they wanted to kind of eradicate Jewish culture and Jewish civilization, if you want to call it that. And in some ways it fits a Marx. I mean, Marx, if you go back to, I forgot which one now, he had a hierarchy of what he called historic and ahistoric peoples, if you remember. So in other words, the Poles were okay because they had a state at one time, so a revived Poland would be okay, but the Slovaks never had a state, so therefore they weren't entitled to anything. He had a hierarchy, as most Victorians did at that time. So, I mean, so these people regarded, the Jews are, we're back to the whole thing, starting with the Jews are a class, therefore. If they're a class, right, or a religion, they don't require a national homeland. I mean, we're going back to these kinds of things. So these people are deciding the nature of the Jewish group. Now, if the nature of the Jewish group is there's not much good about it, and you want to extinguish most of its cultural and other forms, I guess you can be.
And you would put Chomsky in that category.
I don't know.
I just to eradicate Jewish culture.
I don't know. I said certainly not learn, right? But I mean, I'm saying that you said a specific. You didn't give me enough of what. If you'd given me a quotation from it, I would have been able to tell you one way or another, right? But what I'm saying is, it is possible to have somebody, right, who was, I know, let's take somebody, one of the former Soviet Politburo members of Jewish descent, and say yes, they were Judeophobic. No. They wanted to end the Jewish people as an entity in Jewish culture. I think would be fair, and they probably would have admitted that.
Can't one derive from your talk about a Jewish collectivity that to follow it out, there should be no criticism of the Israeli government? There are things about the Israeli government and its policies that are extremely hurtful, I think, to Jewish people and to Jewish interests. And Jews who oppose them, are they to be considered out of the Jewish collectivity? I think that's a very wrong way of looking at it. The Israeli government, certainly in the last 3-4 years, has done things that have aroused not only Jews, and in Europe especially, the anti-Semitism or anti-Jewishness or Judeophobia is strongest in those European countries that were 40 years ago, 30 years ago, most friendly to Israel. And it's in these countries that you are, focusing. That's the
60 years ago, they
Yeah,
were
how they look 60
well, when they were
years
60
ago.
years ago, I mean, we can talk places. But I hate to say this, but maybe I live in a parallel universe, but I don't think I mentioned the state of Israel in the last half hour at all. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I mentioned it. So I don't know where you...
Yes, but everything you say is taken, can be taken, and many followers of your views take it. This is in defense of Israel as it is. Israel as it is. There are many Jewish people who cannot stand any criticism of Israel. Or Sharon.
But you have no evidence to accuse me of that at all at the moment. I mean, I don't understand.
You can make believe it doesn't exist.
What? What doesn't exist?
The fact that many Jewish people, Jewish institutions in this country, most Jewish organization leaders condemn any kind of criticism of the Israeli government.
But that's got very little to do. My topic today is Judeophobia and European extremism. Right?
This is look what's going on in the Israeli parliament.
And I haven't done that. So I think obviously Israel is tied up in this kind of thing. But it depends. I mean, I'm not going to go into this argument. I think, Israel is a very important part of this argument. But I don't think the people who are putting forward these extremist opinions are really that concerned with the individual actions of specific Israeli governments. It's more of it's an ideological commitment. It's about ideas. It's not about specific policies or where this is done or who puts in jail or you put out people out of jail. I don't think that's what it's all about in this case.
You sort of poo-pooed the idea that the biological argument against the Jews has any currency in the extremists in Europe, but it seems to me that the biological argument actually is alive and well in some form or another, especially amongst the National Front demographic. I don't have any empirical evidence for that, but it just seems to me that their predisposition towards biological arguments also conditions their response towards Muslims and the Muslim underclass, and that's important because it seems like one of the main differences between the scapegoating practiced by the extreme left and the extreme right is, for all their consensus on the scurrilousness of the Jews, they have a very different attitude about the Muslim underclass, that's disagreement, I think, is important because it makes it much less likely that there would ever be a kind of popular front against the Jews that would be broad-based enough to become state ideology. But if you don't want to address that, just what does that say about the extremism of these two communities?
What we're talking about is something in the ether and in the air. I mean, I have to turn around and say that there's some militating factors about this which are important. One is that there is no political party, no political government, there's no government which represents a political party that's been elected on an anti-Semitic ticket in Europe in the last 30 years. And it's very important to realise that. So that's a gain from the previous 100 years. So I mean, I'm not trying to say this is the point. And in fact, one of the reasons why I've moved it over into elites and into the, I don't know what you want to call it, the media and culture and all the rest of it, is because this doesn't play very well in terms of political votes anymore about Jews. In many ways. Now, the problem you have about, I mean, we can do about the left and right. There are a number of lefts and a number of rights. But one of the reasons why we're looking at this in a number of different countries is because it is interesting that in Belgium, for instance, the Vlaamse Bloc actually likes Jews but doesn't like. On the other hand, you've got the Freiheitpartei in Austria. Mr. Haider was a great friend of Hussein, and still, Saddam Hussein that is, not Melech Hussein. And he's still going. I mean, in Austria, the far right actually has an old former, the kind of Austrian, the Kaisers and the two Kaisers of the First World War, a kind of pro-Islamic attitude. The anti-Turkish feeling and the rest of it comes not from the far right as much, not interestingly enough. In politics, it comes out of the Catholic, the CDU, the Catholic Socialists, who take a more. They're the ones who are the biggest about not letting Turkey into the EU. But so the Haider is a very good example. And this is the whole problem about, when you go into racism and rest of it, where do these people who, they do create hierarchies maybe of groups, whether it's biological, anybody who really believes they're biological race, it doesn't play anymore. Sort of pseudoscience doesn't seem to operate. If you read their pamphlets, you read their books, and they're hardly ever talking about the same stuff that Rosenberg was talking about in the past, and it doesn't seem to work. But the point is, they have a political message. Who controls who? Really, I mean, it's the whole question is that the blacks, Africans, whatever it is, are a danger. But in fact, but they're really controlled by the Jews. So so this kind of thing. So this is the problem that you have. That's sort of it's the Jews are behind it all. That's how racism things come into it. There are sentiments about some groups still being cleverer than others, more manipulative. It's a kind of conspiracy thing. Sort of these kind of hierarchies. And you get it here with kind of some of these Aryan groups about Zog and all these things. In fact, most Hispanics and blacks are under control of the Jews in this country. But I think that's where it comes out. It's a very crude thing. It's not the scientific racism. That's the whole point. It's not backed by, and this is very important, intelligentsia. You must have to remember that in the past, large numbers of professors and scientists and everything signed up to it until 1945. Very important to realise that there was a whole industry, if you want to call it that, in academia on this, which has vanished from every European place of higher learning.
In a kind of follow-up for what you just asked, how do you actually explain the fact or the idea that you mentioned that you see on the left some kind of resentment of the modernization on concepts, not on technology? How can you explain it? I mean, you might think that, okay, on the right, people will be more, more conservative. The left should be more open to ideas, and
Well, it depends what you call conservative. I mean, the most interesting thing is, in my youth, I visited the Soviet Union. It's one of the few places you couldn't get pornography, and they took the workers to the ballet. In most places that would be regarded as relatively conservative attitude. Force ballet on people and deprive them of pornography in this country. But so what's right and what's left, and that's my whole point. And modernism and anti-modernism, conservative things. It's very important to realise that a lot of this resentment on the left is that you have to understand that in Europe there is there are very large communist parties, right, in France and Italy, very large communist parties, large ones of people. There's always been a very strong socialist sentiment, and there are still many people who are still sitting shiver for the Soviet Union. and they were in shock for about. One of our thinking, if you look it in here, see some argument there. That the people they were kind of overwhelmed. First of all, they were demoralised by Brezhnev and his kind of highly conservative view of the world, which was if for a progressive force in activity was regarded as on all fronts was a peculiarity. So you could see the sclerotic nature of the Soviet Communist Party and its apparatchiki. And then what happened was that the wall fell and the rest. And for a number of years, these people were in a tremendous amount of shock. They just couldn't explain it. How to explain, the end of a dream. And now there's a kind of return of maybe morale or to some extent recommitment. And they, in fact, what has happened in Europe to some extent, it's very interesting here, is that the left has been freed. Some elements of the left. Two things have happened. First of all, the fractiousness of the left has gone. And one of the reasons, let me rephrase it. When the Soviet Union supported the Arab states against Israel, right, some of the groups who were either neutral or thought it would say a good word for Israel were the Trotskyists. Because basically they wanted to frustrate the Communist Party. So it's a kind of Balkan politics. My enemy's enemy is my friend. So at least around the '67 war, you found quite a few Trotskyists, and before around '73 as well, with the Soviet people whose it depended if you hated imperialism more than you hated the Soviet Union, and that depended who'd shot who'd shot your friends, right? I mean, we're talking about real politics here, and purges and things like that. So that's an important issue. Now, the elimination, the implosion of the Soviet Union has had, first of all, demoralised the left, but in fact has made it easier because you no longer have a living example of socialism in action to be for people to turn to and say, well, if it's so wonderul, why is this? If imperialism's so bad, what about the anti-imperialism? So if actually, at the present moment, it's freed up, and that's led to a lot of thinking, especially around the issue of so-called imperialism and globalization and things like that. It was very difficult to argue put some of these arguments in a situation of two superpowers competing. Now you've got Ethiopia and I've got Somalia, and then now we swap. Which was going on. It was very difficult to talk about a third world and that kind of thing. It's now freed up a lot of these people to actually concentrate on the one superpower. Now, the other side, the conservative side of it is there's tremendous feeling that the free market liberalism and the fall of the Soviet Union has undermined the concept of communitarianism, if you want to call it that, or socialism and things like that. And there's a great feeling of that any group of people who believes that let me rephrase it. To me, one of the arguments of a conservative group of people is people who look back to a golden age, right, rather than to the future, right? The tradition on the left was that the future belongs, like the Nazis said, the future belongs to us, but the future was there was an inexorable trajectory which would bring us, bring these people to power and all this stuff. The feeling that the wrong people are running the world now, right? And some of that, and there have been, sort of reverses and things like that, is part of the kind of resentment, if you want to call it that, and kind of conservatism is part of a nostalgia for a different, for a past, and also as I said, the economic situation of some of the people has been, some of them, been downturned. I mean, let's examine. If I was running a newspaper today in the United States, I would also be relatively conservative and anti-modernist person because newspapers are in trouble, right? They had a glorious past. They're sacking people. If I were a newspaper journalist, I would be concerned about new technologies and new ways and things like that. It's a declining business. So I'm a bit like blacksmiths faced by the motor car.
I
I'm wondering to what extent the rise of Judeophobia and this new extremism you've been referring to could really just be seen as a natural reflection of demographic shifts in Europe. You have had, over the past couple of decades, waves of immigrants coming into Europe as guest workers or new citizens from North Africa, from other Muslim countries. Among those groups, anti-Semitism is just, as a statistical matter, much higher. Even if there are fewer in number than their non-Muslim counterparts in the countries which they go to, the disproportionate noise, as it were, that comes out of those groups is going to be much, much larger. At a certain point, and certainly I think this is easily argued to be correct in very specific, constituencies, writings, I mean, the piece in London that George Galloway won and so forth, it just becomes a natural inclination to pander to the population which is making the most noise. And so I guess what I'm saying is that maybe what's happening here is a lot of this is just sort of a reflection of new demographics in these countries. And the one other thing is I really do agree with the comment you made earlier about the rise of technology, in particular the internet, satellite television, and so forth. It makes it so much easier for everybody to sort of see everything at the same time, which means that, if there's a particular item which is viewed as particularly offensive by some group, it's going to be viewed at the same time by people everywhere. So that exacerbates things, that accelerates things. But I'm just wondering whether or not you can, a lot of this is just sort of coming with the territory, as it were.
Well,
Demographic shift.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the example of Galloway, the poor man because of Moslem. There's very little electoral evidence for what you're talking about. One of them is that these people don't vote or they're not citizens and things like that. So in terms of the numbers, they're not as obvious. Now, if you see it as a zero-sum game between Jews and Muslims, right? Well, obviously, if Jewish voting numbers have been eliminated since 1940. So you haven't really got many voters left in many places. And you've got all these new people. So if you see that, so that is, but I mean, on a previous, my point would be on a previous situation.
It doesn't have to be literal votes.
No.
It's more a matter of whose issues do you cater to.
Yeah.
And so it's, think of it as cost minimization.
Yeah. Influence and the rest of it, sort of. I mean, the argument would then be, see, the problem, if you go down that argument, is that, and we'll go back to it, that 20, 30 years ago, these people did pander to Zionist thinking, and now they've seen the better of the ways, or they're pandering to another group of people, which suggests that politicians are either manipulated or have no principles whatsoever. There's a certain argument here that you have to be aware. And when we use them, that people say, well, that's not true. I really do believe in something, and it's not. I'm just doing it because Mr. Ali wrote to me and said that I had to do this. I think you're correct. That there's a feeling that amongst some peoples that the Muslims. One of the things that has actually increased the morale of the left, and it's very interesting, the far left, the Trotskyites especially, communists have got more of a problem with it, has been to see the new Muslim underclass as a kind of shock troops of the revolution. They have given up on the white working class, right, in Britain, in France, and everywhere else. I mean, the buggers either go to, have either got cars and go to Spain for their holidays, or they join the National Front. I mean, the ones who fail join the National Front, the ones who do well become, sort of respectable and sort of become part of the, bourgeoisie or the petty bourgeoisie or consumers anyway. So they're lost. And so you're looking for a new group of things. So that's what creates a climate there. And there, I think, it has an effect, especially. But it's not having a great effect in electoral politics. It is in these areas that I'm talking about. It's in the media. It is the things that the communities I was dealing with are made uncomfortable by. Is the news broadcasts, the newspapers, the demonstrations, the films, the radio stations, and sort of the BBC, for instance. I think the classic thing. It's in the book. Classic thing. they have what is known as the promenade concerts at the Albert Hall. And in the interval there, they had somebody talking about, some correspondent talking about their kind of a walk-in Ramada or something like that, you know, sort of, it's 2 years ago in the middle. There's a kind of entertainment. They had 15 minutes between, you know, Prokofiev and Mozart, and they decided to shove in somebody talking about their own correspondent talking about a walk-in Ramada and speaking to Arabs on the street about how miserable their lives are as a result of the Jewish, you know, Israeli government and their wicked policies. And they were not in any way sort of inarticulate. Luckily, they found the 6 people who could speak English. It was remarkable. But so you know, but there's that kind of thing. That's what making many things. I mean, you know, the idea that you can have large numbers of Muslim cabinet ministers or anything like that. I mean, as you know, I mean, it's only part. Britain has got 12 people of ethnic origin. I think 2 or 3 are Muslims. You know, 635 in the House of Commons. France has got exactly 0. Belgium has got 1. Germany's got 2. I mean, you know, it's going to, at this rate, you know, it'll be 1,000 years. But that's part of it. It doesn't mean to say, because, and this is very important to see, you see, your whole point about a zero-sum game, right? You've decided it's all about Israel and the rest of it. The fact is that you can be an equal opportunity, you can make life miserable for left-handed people, ginger-haired people, and Jews, right? You can be nasty to these people, and it still hurts Jewish people, even if you don't hurt others. And you hurt others at the same time. Or, right, I mean, it's like hospital triage. You know, I've got a broken leg, and you've got a pancreatic ulcer or something. You know, you go first, but it doesn't mean to say I'm not hurting, right? So this is very important to realise that we have to get this back into a situation where we look at these forms of prejudice, that extremism is a bad thing, right? Which is where I began. It is not a good thing. Voting for these far left and far right political parties, supporting them in France, doesn't strike me as making a pleasant life for many, many people. It's a track record that's just ain't good for anybody, never mind the Jews. The Jews might be the first ones. Second thing is that anti-Semitism thing is not usually, you know, the Jews more than other people, but it does create eventually an atmosphere in society, right? We're picking on people, and you know, it's like bullying. You know, I decide to bully her, but once the whole class decides bullying is a good thing, you aren't going to be, you know, so safe after all. So you have to see this as a moral issue as much as anything else, I think. And I think, and this is the arguments we're trying to make out there, that in fact, you know, it's not just a Jewish problem. Right? And I think this is very important to get over to people who are terribly outraged by Israel and its wall. Right? So you think the worst thing in the world is a wall or separation fence and the rest of it. But is your reaction to that wall, are the consequences, the outcomes, and your act, you know, are they a precedent for other people getting terribly excited about other things, which eventually creates a world where, you know, everybody's, you know, kvetching about something, but they move from kvetching to, you know, murder is the problem.
I wonder to what extent the decline in the situation of Jews in Europe is related to anti-Americanism. In this country, there are some people who say that the fortunes of America in the Middle East have been affected by Israel. If we didn't support Israel, then America would have a much better standing among Arab countries. But in this case, I'm wondering to what extent the fortune of Jews is actually affected by the fact that Jews are somehow seen as being in league with America, as America's maybe representatives, not that they're on the front lines, that they are actually the beneficiaries of American power.
Right. Well, there's two people. I guess it's like the optimist and the pessimist. I mean, there are two groups of people. One believe that America uses Israel as a surrogate and kind of in Sparta for its own ends and the rest of that. And they're the moderates. And the other people believe that Israel and the Jews control the United States, and I guess that's the other side. And again, that has a long history, right? You read Mein Kampf, that's what, it's there. Marshal Petain, right, has spent all his time in 41 and 42 attacking the Anglo-Saxons who were under the influence and control of the Jews. Down the Anglo-Saxon powers, sort of Roosevelt and Churchill were jumping at the, I don't know if you imagine Churchill jumping, but I mean, actually, jumping at, when told how high by the Jews, or replied how high. I mean, this has a long history, this kind of anti-Americanism of the Jews. That you have this, and then comes on the right, it's all about a Negroid, multicultural, multi-racial America and all the rest of it. And because they have this, and the interesting thing is, it comes back to some of this biological racism. Because the Jews are innately clever, right? They are manipulative, they're clever, they're satanic, but they've got the brain power, And these people are willing to accept that Jews have got brains, right? But these brains are used against are detrimental to the rest of mankind in their eyes. But you don't deny the abilities of Jews. Right? So that the Jews have this, so therefore they are in control. So you have these, you have this idea that is. And it comes out in the diplomatic thing, that sort of, again, so that the Israel government, you read in reasonably respectable magazines, not on the mainstream, but always say that when Sharon goes to Bush, he's going to give him his orders,
Right.
That kind of thing, to tell him what to do and things like that. So you get that out, and it's a kind of conspiracy thing. And then, of course, what did come out very clearly in all of it is this insidious thing, and this is where the Jewish stuff and the conspiracy. Conspiracy theories have been very strong on the left and the right, right? Mainly because the right wing have always believed in them for satanic reasoning. But the left, if you remember it, any group of people that operates on a cell system, which is what most left-wing far-left parties did for 100 years, right? Party cells and all the rest of it, where you got messages and have a revolutionary, violent revolutionary tradition, breeding conspiracies. I mean, Lenin was a great believer in that. And he operated, as you know, as an agent of the Germans when he went back in a closed wagon to St. Petersburg in 1917. So, they believe in a worldview where conspiracies are involved. And what seemed to have a big effect in 2002, 2003 was the neoconservatives. This was it. Neocon meant the elders of Zion. And that got right into the mainstream. I don't think there was any newspaper that didn't refer to the Jewish influence, and the neocons wanting a war, and the neocons operating on behalf of Israel and getting their orders from that.
See, then I accept your idea that racism as it existed in the 1930s and 40s does not exist that way now. But the fact is that any Jew any Jewish neocon, however connected he is to the Jewish people or not, is seen as a Jew. So it may not be biological racism, but it's that every one of the Jews is part of a collectivity.
That's not true.
Which
The whole point, exceptions are made. The point was, to Hitler, even Noam Chomsky would be somebody who was trying to fight it. But these people are willing to say there are good Jews. There are Chomskys. Even Michael Lerner's to some extent, coming back to that. So they're willing to make exceptions. And once you do that, exception proves the rule. So it's not biological. It's not every Jew.
I'm not arguing that it's biological.
Yeah.
But I'm arguing that anti-Semitism really, and even Hitler had his good Jews. He was able to make Jews into honorary Aryans. It's the idea that that if you are a Jew, you function as a member of a collectivity, and a collectivity that may not be biologically different, but it is inalterably other. it doesn't belong.
I'm on the far extremes, you have to say that.